Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Enrichment Series webinar. I'm your host, Amir Ganad, and I will be moderating a panel with fabulous guests. Now, without further ado, I want to just very briefly introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we will turn on our webcams and get on with the conversation. And so each of these individuals has just a wonderful resume of things that they've done. But just let me quickly go over their name and their title, and then we will ask them to introduce themselves. Our first panelist, Najoh Tita-Reid, is the General Manager and Chief Marketing Officer at Logitech. She's a brand innovator. She joins us from Zurich, Switzerland. Our next panelist is Susan Oguche. She is the Global Communications Director with Nike. She's an award-winning brand builder and a corporate storyteller. And last but not least, we have Andre Norman with us. Andre is the founder of the Academy of Hope. And I hope that you have taken the time to look at the video that we had put into the announcements. This is a short video that really speaks to the wonderful work that Andre has done. He's the author of Ambassador of Hope. He is known as the Felon turned Harvard Fellow, and we are really glad to have him, as well as Najoh and Susan. All right, looks like technology is on our side. Very good.
Right. I mean, I just need to clarify that I am not the Chief Marketing Officer. I'm the Global Head of Marketing. I don't want to take somebody's job, so I just want to make sure I'm fair and equitable at least.
Okay, my mistake, one of many mistakes I'm sure that I will make in this conversation, but please blame it on my head, not my heart. I apologize. Thanks for that correction. All right, so thank you so much for being here. Just want to, before I turn it over to you all to do a quick sort of introduction on yourself, I do want to say just a couple of words about what this is about. And so, again, whether you're participating live or you are listening to this, looking at this as a recording, I'd really like you to basically relate to this not as an academic exercise to learn about racism, because most of us know some of the basic things. This is an exercise where we actually get to hear from our panelists about their personal experiences and their reflections, and with the intention that we would each then walk away with some personal reflections around how we feel, what we've learned about ourselves, what will we do, what questions will we ask. So I would really ask you to kind of get into that frame of mind. The other thing that I would also like to explicitly bring up is that our panelists are not here as D&I experts. I mean, oftentimes I think what our society does is that we sort of put this burden on people who belong to a minority group to say, okay, well, you must be the expert. Tell us how to fix this thing. Well, you know what? While each of our panelists is uniquely qualified to speak to some aspects of this, we're not going to put that burden on them as kind of the expert. Yes, there are many experts out there, and we can get some expertise from these folks. But again, please participate in this conversation to learn and understand their personal experiences. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask our panelists to give us an introduction about yourself, your background. So Najoh, please start us off with that.
Great. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I live in Zurich, Switzerland today with my husband and 2 kids. I grew up between the US and Cameroon, West Africa. And so that says a lot about my background. And so wanted my kids in the future to have the global experience that I had been afforded. And to know that they were global citizens of the world. And so that is a bit me personally. Professionally, I worked at P&G for 19 years and then some time in advertising and healthcare and a little bit in food before I joined technology, and I had the privilege of starting my career in sales at P&G, marketing at P&G, and then moving to general management before I became Chief Marketing Officer and member of an executive board here in Switzerland, which was a fantastic experience, and worked for 2 non-US companies, one German and one more Swiss German. And now I'm back with an American company where I'm the global head of marketing and owning marketing reinvention for Logitech. And it's been a fantastic experience. And I'm in a place where I believe I'm working with several people who are committed and working for a CEO who is very much dedicated to being anti-racist. And so I say that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Najoh. How about Susan? Why don't you go next?
Hello. I said Susan. I'm currently with Nike. I started at P&G as a little baby intern and had 8 wonderful years there working in the external relations / communications world. Like Najoh, my family is also West African. I was born in Nigeria, but I grew up here, so moved to the States when I was 5 years old. But always kind of had this dual identity of being an immigrant, but also feeling very much a connection to the African-American experience. So I'm really honored to be able to be on this panel and get to share a little bit of my thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Andre.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, people. As introduced, my name is Andre. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, born and raised. As a young man, I got off the tracks and like so many others in my space, and I went to prison. And I stayed in prison for roughly 14 years, at which time I went through a lot of more trauma. But I finally decided to turn my life around and do something different. And with the help and support of mentors, I was able to get myself out of prison and eventually become a fellow. And along the way, I've had appointments from the White House, the London Business School, a few other places. But I've been doing social justice work for the last 21 years because my life and my work is all one with social justice. So our team stopped the riots in Ferguson back in 2016. And I currently mentor Michael Brown Sr., who's the father of Michael Brown Jr. And we're actually trying to put together a platform for himself because I come to be a forgiveness coach versus just an angry dad. And our goal is simple with the Academy of Hope, to create impact around the world. And I've had the pleasure of working in 30 countries, as well as living in Liberia, working in Monrovia with child soldiers and others. So it's a pleasure to meet my sisters, you know what I'm saying, and my brother, and whatever we can do to be helpful.
Thank you so much for being here, Andre. It is such a wonderful privilege to have you all. And I also want to share just a little bit about my background as the moderator of this, and for a couple of reasons that I will mention. So I've been married to a Black woman for 39 years. Basically, that's my family here. I came to the States when I was 16 years old from Iran. And so my family, as far as I know, has been a Black family, if you will. And I've lived in Thailand, I've lived in Germany, and I've also had the experience of living here, obviously, in a kind of a multiracial kind of setting. And here's why I mention that. One is that I think it's important in the spirit of full disclosure that everybody knows sort of where my biases and my perspective is coming from. But the second reason I mention that is that often there's this misconception that simply because I have a Black friend, I could not be racist. Oh, I'm married to a Black woman, I cannot be racist, right? So I think there's that perception as well, when in fact it is real clear to me that while, you know, we have been sort of, we've been told we couldn't buy a house in a certain neighborhood, we've been refused service in a restaurant or whatever, but when I go out by myself, I have a completely different experience. So it is still, I cannot claim that I completely understand. And so with that, I just want to kind of ask about this notion of what Dr. Kendi talks about in his book about being anti-racist. And so, you know, most of the pain and suffering that is inflicted, at least that we have experienced, has not come from card-carrying KKK members. It has come from some well-meaning people who consider themselves not racist. And I wonder if you all can share some of your experiences in the similar arena around what are some things that people do in an innocent way, or what experiences have you had with people who are not really, you know, racist per se by definition of the society, of our society, but they're hurtful, maybe not even knowing. So I'll open it up. How about we go with Susan first this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that a lot of people of color, predominantly Black people, do experience the not necessarily KKK, but when we talk about what's going on in the summer uprising and we talk about police brutality and those things, those are literally situations where people's lives are at risk or ended because of the structures of racism and how that comes to life. And I, you know, I can say I've had a lot of small examples of racism personally. Everything from, you know, we recently sold our house in Chicago to relocate to Portland, and our realtor came in when we were listing, and he was like, "You need to take down all of your family photos." And he's like, "Look, this isn't PC, but if you want to sell your house, you need to take down your family photos." Obviously, I'm a Black woman, my husband is Black, my child is Black. And so that idea that we had to strip our racial identity from our house so that people would want to live there or that we would get a fair market price, I think that's just one of the everyday examples of how racism and structural racism plays out.
Yeah, very good. How about you, Najoh?
No, I would say, you know, just like Susan, there's big and small ones, but I think for this audience in particular, the small ones are the ones that I think are most important because they come across as microaggressions and they impact people that you probably don't want to hurt. They might actually be people that you want to help. I'll give two examples that you know, would have happened in a similar alumni environment that this group is familiar with. I'd say, you know, one is when you're worked really hard in your career and the hiring manager says, "I'm going to take a risk on you." That is a huge microaggression, especially if your colleague who might not be a person of color, who has the same qualifications and background, they say they're well deserving of the job. So to say you're taking a risk on me would assume that there's something about me that's risky. And so that's something that sticks with people. It also puts people at a disadvantage and makes them have to prove themselves in the job, which is already a drain in energy. And you'll hear a lot of people saying, "I have to prove myself in the job, prove myself." Well, anyone who's proving themselves is not performing their best very often because they're already feeling that at a deficit. So that's one that I would definitely share about taking a risk on people. And there's the opposite, of course, which is you can take a bet on someone and support somebody. So I'll give you that example for now.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. How about you, Andre? I think you're on mute.
The example I'm going to share is when George Floyd died this past June. Every white friend I have called me. Business owners from all over the world, because I've been training for 21 years now. Everybody from, I'm not going to name the companies, they all called and they did one or two things. "Andre, we didn't know. Andre, what can we do?" There's this whole scenario of that. And then just the fact that you've been living, I've been 53 years on this planet, 50, 60 years, and call me in 2020 and say, "I didn't know." What rock have I been under that was real? And we go back to Rodney King for white America and say that was real. And we can go back to Malcolm X and say that was real. We can go back to Martin Luther King and say that was real. But at no time, they're like, "Wow, that's what you're talking about for 400 years. And they, for whatever reason, the hurtful part is they don't want to attach that to the huge atrocity. Not slavery wasn't the atrocity because it's happened throughout history. The treatment of the Black American slave was the atrocity. And they don't want to make the connection. What hurts to me is you don't want to make the connection between slavery, incarceration, and George Floyd. It's just like, can this be an isolated incident, please? And to me, you just wiped out my whole heritage.
Yeah. Yeah, and so this is where I think, again, just kind of digging into this topic of being not racist versus being anti-racist. I mean, there's a difference, right? Because many people sort of let themselves off the hook by saying, "Look, I'm not racist." And they have their reasons. They say, "Okay, look, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, and whatever. I even called my Black friend. I'm not racist." But what is the distinction between not racist and someone who is truly anti-racist? So I'll leave that open to whoever wants to jump in.
Andre, you want to start this one?
No, ladies first all the time. My grandmother would have it no other way.
So, I'll take a start because we could talk about it for hours, obviously. But I'd say, since we're meaning to be as pragmatic as possible in this webinar, I would say if you are anti-racist, you are actively working to fight racism. And I'll leave it just that simple. It's not a passive thing. You are making it a commitment that you're going to focus on. And I someone very dear in my life talks about the difference between concern and commitment. And I think fighting for anti-racism and being committed to having it go away is what an anti-racist is. So that's, to me, what that looks like.
Yeah, and so if I could just say one thing, and this is, I asked everybody to reflect. So really, please ask yourself the question: what am I doing to actively, end racism? Yeah, please, Susan.
Yeah, I mean, I was blown away by the book and just the understanding. I mean, I've always been taught that like racism is this idea of race plus power, and so it almost absolves people who are not white because of when you think about structural racism, it absolves them in some way. But then when you reflect, you think, there's a lot of ways that racism is built into our systems, our hiring systems, for example, where we look at people from specific universities, or we may deselect people who are part of, a Black Greek fraternity. And sometimes it might be unconscious, but there's the thing that I love about that word anti-racist is that it takes racism out of the context of being about my personal actions or my personal feelings. Like whether you're, nice to people who are of different races or not. And it also, for me, having kind of a different experience growing up, very much Nigerian and feeling like I came to this country not thinking of myself as a Black person. Like, I mean, I came very young, but I remember being in elementary school and somebody being like, "You're Black, you're bad." And I was like, "I'm Nigerian. Like, that's my culture." I didn't have a context of like, oh, there's this thing called Black and it's bad. And there's this thing called white and it's good, because I came from a culture where everyone was Black. I saw Black doctors. My parents are both academics with PhDs. And so it's always been a tension for me. But then that idea of that I can actually participate in anti-Blackness even as a Black person by being prejudiced against people who come from, a different background from me, by not being open from even just a friend standpoint from people who might be in a different class level or a different education level. And so I think that idea of being anti-racist, it allows us to understand that we participate in racism even if we're not racist. And it takes the personal insult of being called a racist out of it and says there's a structure that has nothing to do with you, or that we kind of inherited as a country, but you can be cognizant of it and you can help to dismantle it just by nature of being aware. So I think it's a really helpful context to think about race, and it really kind of plants it firmly in the structural context of race versus, the relational or interpersonal aspect of race.
Yeah, and when you become aware that you have biases against certain race or gender or age group or whatever, and when you become aware that we all have biases, then I think you're more likely to be able to identify biases against other groups. So really sort of doing a deep dive in ourselves and becoming self-aware doesn't just help in one arena, but others, doesn't it? Yeah. How about you, Andre? Go ahead.
I want to approach it from the standpoint of not anti-racist, but I'm pro other people. We could say pro-Black, because I'm pro-Black. And I want to put it in context where I do storytelling. How do I say this to the people to make them get it? Because when we start having the conversations about racism, anti-racism, disenfranchisement, people get lost because it's not their daily conversation. So I want to put this in the context that hopefully everybody can understand, because the majority of people on this platform has kids. I am pro Brooks Elliott Norman. When I go to a basketball game, when I go to a soccer game, when I go to a fencing, I root for my kid. I don't care who's against him, how good or bad he's doing. I'm rooting for my kid. Anything he does, I cheer. And I'm supporting him no matter what. and I came to the game to support them. And whoever's on the other side, technically it's the enemy. So do you support your kid actively? Or do you go to a game and you're neutral? You just go to the game and say, whoever wins, wins. Oh, that kid scored, it's not a big deal. My son scored a touchdown, so what? No, you actively support your child. I actively support. So do you actively support the cause of being fair? Let's just call it fair. Fair. I mean, anti-racist, because once we throw the terms in, people get lost. Are you actively being fair? You know what fair means. I know what fair means. Are you actively being fair to all people? Or are you being judgmental? When I go to a basketball game, I am super judgmental about the other team. These are nice little kids, 12-year-olds, but I don't like them. And I'm hoping they trip. I don't want them to get hurt, but I want them to fall. So I'm actively pro-social for a specific team. And whoever's on that team, I'm inadvertently rooting for. So that's kind of how white folks do. They're inadvertently rooting for themselves and not looking at it as such. And we're the other team. You might not want anything bad to happen to us, but you don't want us to win because you want your team to win. And so I want context for the folks who are on this call to say, okay, well, I'm not against, but when you're the majority, you have a responsibility.
Yeah, so we've talked about the value and the importance of actually taking action to make sure that we end racism. What does that look like? I know each of you has a certain passion and you're involved in many different ways. So I'd like to hear your perspective on basically what action should people take? Not that everybody should do exactly the same thing, but what are some suggestions that you have that people take to eliminate racism? How about you, Najoh? Just so we're not waiting for each other. Go ahead.
Small questions, America. So that's a big one. And I also love how, Andre, you cannot avoid the light. You are in the light. And use that as a metaphor, exactly. What I would say people can do to actively be anti-racist. One thing I'll stick to, systems. Because we all talk about this thing called systemic racism, and it sounds so big. But if it's true, as we have experienced, then you have to just look around you and figure out what is one area of systemic racism that exists, and how can I work proactively to get rid of it and change it. It actually is not as hard as it might sound, right? So you're noticing that your recruitment policy, recruits from schools where there's not any diversity. Well, then you change that policy. And then you actively go out and find, interns that look differently, like P&G did many, many years ago, which is how I got into P&G. And Susan actually started in P&G, right? P&G actively decided that they wanted to change the face of their manager and actively worked to find us at the age of 17 or 16 or something. And that's how I came to P&G at 17 years old. It wasn't a mistake. John Pepper, as a leader, made that decision, and I'm forever grateful, for that. But that's an active notion. Do that. It's not enough to change racism, but it's clearly an action that can be done to change a systemic issue. So that's one example. There's
fantastic, and I think that leaves the option open for all of us to kind of look around and say, what is really truly breaking your heart? And so I have a problem with that, and go take action. Great. How about you, Susan?
I mean, just to build on that, I loved kind of Najoh's comment at the top of the discussion around I'm taking a chance on you. But what's really inherent in that is that opportunities are not equal. They're not given to everybody. And so that's what I think is so powerful about the example she mentioned about Inroads, an organization I'm still super passionate about, and being able to give people access to opportunity. You can't be what you don't see, and you can't find from places you're not looking. And so when people say, oh, there's not enough Black engineers, or there's not enough Black doctors, or there's not enough Black, fill in the blank, I would challenge people to look at, countries that are Black, predominantly Black countries, and there are every single profession under the sun in those countries. So there's no limit to capacity. There's no limit to, mental ability. There's just a limit to opportunity. And so whether it is an internship opportunity and trying to make sure you're intentional about, bringing in diverse interns, or whether it is looking at what organizations get funding and investing capital in people who, who would otherwise not get it. Or even a example very near and dear to my heart, my brother was given a scholarship to MIT by an MIT alum that also went to Walnut Hills. For those people that kind of live in the Cincinnati area, he otherwise would not have been able to afford that. And now he's gone on to be an executive at Goldman Sachs. And that's somebody, I mean, he's brilliant. Maybe he would have been there anyways, but the ability to access opportunity is not equal to everyone. And I think whatever place we are in life, whether it is being able to give a scholarship or being able to give funding or being able to just have an open door for somebody who might not fit the stereotypical or archetype of who you think a leader is, I think that's really how we can make change.
Very good. And Andre, I know you work in an area, in a field, if you will, that has a significant amount of this disparity relative to criminal justice and prisons and that sort of thing. What is your perspective on how one can be anti-racist and actively end racism?
Criminal justice is a huge term. I don't know if it's justice, but it's definitely criminal.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I would say for us my first stance is, if you want to be a racist, I'm okay with that. I have zero problem with you wanting to be a racist, but please do not come to the inner city and try to be a cop. Don't come to the inner city and want to be a school teacher. Be a racist out in the town with a bunch of people who look like you, that'll tolerate you and you can get along with, that you won't shoot or uneducate. So do not be a racist and come into the city and say you want to work around or over or in control of Black folks. That's my problem with racists. Not that you don't like me, but you want to work in a neighborhood that I can't get away from. I am trapped in the inner city. I am stuck in this boundary based on poverty, based on redlining and a lot of other things. You have, as the racist and the white person, has the ability to go live in the suburbs. Go to the suburbs, be a cop. They hire cops out there. They have school teachers out there, and most of the kids look just like you. Don't come to the city and want to be a racist and work with us, because you're not working with us. And I would say to end racism or to combat it, I don't know if you can end it, because you have the right to like or not like who you want, but you have to call it out. That's what it comes down to. So it happens in small micro conversations, small jokes, small things, and it's those small conversations. If we make racism this big giant mall, I can't build a mall. I can't buy a mall, but I can buy a house. I can rent a room. So if we make racism the small conversation that each person on this call can say, okay, there's 3 conversations that need to be had. One, with the people you work with. If you're the boss, have the conversations. It's going to be uncomfortable, but have it. Second is with your friends and family. Have the conversation. And third, and most importantly, you have to have it with your kids, because if not, we'll be having this conversation 30 years from now, because all the lynching photos that I've seen, there were 8, 9, and 10-year-olds in attendance. And they grew up to do the same thing their parents did and the people older than them did, and is replicated. So it's imperative that we have conversations in those 3 areas. And lastly, to Sister Susan's point, as far as finding people, if you're a company, you look around the room and there's no Black people, what are you doing about it? I go in the rooms all the time, and I'm like the only Black guy. So I'm looking at the white person saying, when you look around the room, before I got here, what were you doing? Just accepting status quo. You need to be saying, okay, we need diversity. Diversity is better for business, and it's better for a lot of things. So lastly, if you're sitting in a company or you're sitting in a space and you're like, I don't know what to do. There's not enough Black engineers. If that's your line, there's not enough Black engineers, and Africa's too far or India's too far, let your company go get a school, which is, we already know the inner city public schools are horrendous. Adopt a school and raise them up. Give them the opportunity to be like Susan's brother. You can go adopt an elementary school. I can tell you what every criminal that's going to end up in prison in the next 10 years is sitting right now. He's sitting in the K-1. He's sitting in elementary school, 8 years old, confused, lost, with no direction. And you, giant company or individual person, can make a difference. But you're not, or you haven't chose to. So let me help you out. Go find an elementary school. Peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a hug will do a lot of good.
Andre, I just wanted to jump on one of the points you just made, although they were all fantastic, and that is around children, because I have been surprised, but not shocked, by the conversations I've had with some of my white friends, where we're having a conversation, they've read a book, the ongoing awareness that is happening, especially in 2020. And then we talk about our children, and the response is, well, have you talked to your children? I said, well, I had to talk to my children. Like, this is it's not an option for an African American woman to have to talk to their children. In fact, I talked at 3 and then at 5, and I had to talk and explain what the talk was. And they said, well, I don't really want to talk to my children because I don't want them to know about this or to lose their innocence or their childhood. That, I would say to everybody, is irresponsible. I think that if you want to be an anti-racist, and you do want your kids to grow up as anti-racist, to not have the conversation can be negligent. How you have the conversation, of course, matters. But to not have it at all, I do believe is gross negligence at all. And to think that you're going to ruin your child's innocence by helping them understand the world in which they live in, I think will only recreate the history of the past. Because there is a thought process, of course, that if my child doesn't know it, they won't learn it, and the future is going to be anti-racist. I wish that were the case, but unfortunately, someone might teach them because you didn't, and that is the risk. And so finding out a way to educate them in a way that you feel comfortable, of course, is very, very critically important. I say that for all of our children, is why I say.
And I say this, myself and my wife do not smoke. And my wife has a PhD from MIT and a master's from Harvard. And she speaks 5 languages and she's brilliant. And anytime I say that, people ask me, is your wife white? I say, no, she's a black girl from Brooklyn. But it's automatic when I say PhD, MIT, master's, Harvard. They're like, Dre, you married a white lady? I'm like, no, I married a sister from New York. What are you talking about? It's just the perception, but that's secondary. Me and my wife don't smoke. We don't drink. My son last year, guess what? He tried vaping. He didn't get it from us. His friends taught him. But when he did it, we were able, of course we caught it because he's not good at it. He got caught, he's 14. But when we caught it, we could have the conversation and correct it. Life is going to happen to your kids. Sex, drugs, vaping, bad jokes, racism, they're going to encounter it all. The fact that you don't do it is nice. That's applaudable. But if you don't educate your kids, don't think because you're not doing it that they're not doing it. They're going to encounter it. And it's only as a parent can I make the correction, but it has to happen. We had the conversations about what's bad for you. He has his friends who think it's cool. Then he adopts that. Then we find it and we correct it. Now he understands not just it's a no, but it's not acceptable because we've had the exact conversation after he's bumped his head.
And yeah, absolutely. And I think to all that, the point around children, just remembering how they watch what we do more than even what we say. In the same way, Andre was just reminding us to look around the room, at our offices and make sure that there's diversity represented there, or question when there's not. I think we also need to do that in our social and personal interactions. If you're telling your children like we're anti-racist, here's what we believe, that's great. That's farther than a lot of people. But if you look around your social circle and everyone at your child's school is white, everyone that you interact with, everyone in your place of worship, everybody in your social circle, there's an opportunity for us to learn from each other, even in the social settings. I had people that I hadn't spoken to in years, many, many years, reach out to me kind of similarly to everyone's story, over the summer as people were trying to understand. And I was excited to talk to them and kind of reconnect and share my experience, but also kind of made me sad because I'm like, I am not even I actually am having a hard time recalling, how we met or the last time we spoke. And the fact that I'm the only Black person that you could reach out to and speak to is actually part of the problem. And so trying to make sure that if we are, trying to be anti-racist, it doesn't mean find the nearest Black person and be friends with them and force yourself upon them, but really questioning why am I friends with these type of people? And I think it actually, for me, goes into that idea of intersectionality too, which I know is something that we're going to get into in a little bit later. But we all have biases. Like we wouldn't be human beings functioning in this world if we didn't quickly make judgments on, okay, this is safe, this is not safe, this is good, this is not good. That's just the way that we are wired as humans. And we have to constantly fight against that. And so if you're looking around the room and everyone looks like you, whatever that looks like is, whether it's everybody has a PhD, or everybody is, heteronormative, or everybody is XYZ, able-bodied, we have to really be questioning, why we have our circles so small. And I think that's really the process of kind of self-discovery, and the process of being anti-racist, or whatever it is that we want to call it, is not just making it a thing out there that I need to solve, but saying, okay, I want to create a better future for my kids. I need to model that in my own personal life as well.
We've had a couple of questions. That's really a great conversation we're having here. I've had a couple of questions that have come in that I sort of want to set the table for, and that is, how do you take advantage of these teaching moments, and how do you actually begin the dialogue with the circle around you? And I have to say, many years ago, I sort of gave up on, being the reform agent for every racist I come across. But I've also been guilty of not necessarily correcting some of close friends. I mean, many years ago, we were sitting by a lake with a really, really dear friend of ours we've known for many years, very wonderful lady, older lady. And all of a sudden she turns to my wife and says, well, I really like you. You're not like other Black people. And I have to admit that I have never gone back to that person and say, well, do you understand that you just insulted an entire race while you thought you were complimenting? So I'm guilty of that, of not using that as a teaching moment. I've never talked to that lady about this issue. But what is your idea of how do you actually start dialogue? How do you use these teaching moments to approach folks, to cause them to see something they couldn't see before?
I would say 2020s, yeah, go ahead, Susan.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say 2020's been like no other year in history. And I would first just call out, because I think people have gotten so used to this year that they don't realize how different it is than last year. So I would just say, as a Black person last year, you couldn't say the word racist and not be viewed as hostile. So that was last year, right? You couldn't look around and say that person's racist and someone be defensive and having an argument, and you couldn't use the word systemic racism in a work environment where people didn't think that you had a chip on your shoulder and those types of things. So I want people to really understand, for those of us, at least here, the world has made a major shift in some ways in the past year for what's acceptable to talk about. I don't want to say that change has happened, but just what's acceptable to talk about has been massive. And so while people are awakened and are experiencing and feeling comfortable, you need to know that for our whole lives, we've been trying to talk about these things in some form or fashion. Many gave up because it was a fight every time you mentioned something that was obvious to you. So I just wanted to call out that shift. Now that we're open to these conversations, you first have to understand it may not be comfortable for many people to have these conversations because they've been hurt or fired or threatened when they had them 400 times before. So just also be a bit more empathetic if someone's not so willing to start an anti-racist group at work, because that was highly unlikely that you'd be staying there for, in the past. But for now, I'd say just start the conversation. It depends on how anti-racist you want to be, if there's such a degree, right? My husband and I, we have a group of friends that we go skiing with, and because of where we are in circumstances, they all happen to be white. And when BLM happened and we were marching and doing all the things that our family was committed to doing, we invited them to come along, right? That was one thing. We then decided, well, no one actually wants to start the conversation, we're going to start it. And we had a Zoom with all the couples. And we said, let's just be great to talk about race and your experience with it. Not just because they have experiences with race, we all have a race and background, and kind of open it up for a Q&A. That would have never happened. We could have been friends our whole life and it might have never happened. And so we were proactively opening ourselves up to have a conversation. And it was eye-opening to them, the experiences that we've had similar to what you guys have shared before in the same situation. Skiing for us is not the same as skiing for them. Being able to live in Switzerland is not the same for us as it was for them, but they were things that they actually would have never known because we spent a lot of time talking to our own communities and not to each other. And so we became committed to starting a series of conversations outside of our own race, because that's the only way that we're going to change it. So it's maybe a bit of a drastic movement, but I can say our friendship, of course, has gotten deeper, and they're able to ask questions without feeling they're going to put their foot in their mouth, because any of us can do that, but no progress can happen without it. And so that's one thing we've done.
Fantastic. Thank you. How about you,
Yeah,
Susan?
and I would just add to that I think I felt a lot of urgency in the beginning, in the beginning of 2020 or the middle of 2020, I guess it's been a really long year, of feeling like I had to just download all of my experience to people really fast. And it's like, oh, you want to listen? Like, here's what happened to me in 8th grade, and here's this, and here's that, and here's police brutality, and here's slavery, and here's redlining. And I just felt like I had to be this encyclopedia of the racial history of this country. And I think, as we've gone over the next, kind of the latter part of 2020, this takes a long time, and all of us are excavating stuff that's deeply rooted that we didn't even understand. And even I've had to, open myself up into when you have conversations about mass incarceration and a friend telling me, this is connected to slavery. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's about people getting punished for what they're doing. And they're like, no, here's what it means. And people can't vote like they've served, and here's how somebody who forged a check is getting 30 years in prison. And here's how that's all connected to what's going on in the inner city and taking fathers away. And so we're all on a process of learning. And I think I kind of came into it being like, I'm the Black person. And sometimes we even impose that on people of color of like, okay, you should know every single thing about race. And I don't think anybody does unless they are Dr. Kennedy and have studied it for their entire career. And so I think for me, it's just like slowing down and taking the urgency out of it a little bit, and leaning heavily on relationships and knowing that the conversation's not going to be one and done. It might be an ongoing conversation. You might come to it multiple times. Somebody might act like they're not listening and then come back and be like, oh, that thing you said to me, I've been thinking about that. And just being open. And I think just over indexing on empathy, over indexing on relationship, especially if it's a conversation you're having with somebody you care about. Up to now, you had a relationship with that person, you cared for that person. And so being able to lean on that, even if you are calling someone out and saying, hey, I know that you didn't mean that, really kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt, but knowing that there's an urgency in that, every single day people's lives are lost and impacted because of racism. But the conversations are going to take time, and you can slow down and allow space for that.
Very good. How about you, Andre?
I would say, it starts with ourselves. When we try to put it on other people, it makes it easier for us not to get stuff done. So we have to be self-responsible and accountable to what is it that we want to learn, what is it that we want to do relative to action steps. I do global outreach. So I've worked from Honduras to Guatemala to West Africa to Saudi Arabia, Australia, and a bunch of other places, 30 countries. When I went to the Latin countries, and I'm trying to help kids, I had an interpreter because I don't speak Spanish. And it was my sense that the interpreters were ripping the kids off at the end of the day. He would just talk, and the money we would give to the kids would never get to the kids, or the money we would give to the programs would end up going in his pocket. So I grew up in the street. I know a hustle when I see one, and this is his hustle. So I was like, okay, I didn't like that. So as people are sitting home saying, I saw George Floyd, I didn't like that. I saw this one, I didn't like that. So when I saw this happening, I didn't like that. So I did something. So cuando yo regreso a próximo vez, yo hablo para niños directo. Yo no necesito pasar a hablar para mí, porque yo trabajo para Dios, yo quiero el niño tener ayuda, porque es muy necesito de no mafioso. Busca dinero, yo quiero para esos niños más por vida, más I learned Spanish. You weren't going to rob these kids because I couldn't speak Spanish. You weren't robbing the kids because you was a thief. You were robbing the kids because I wouldn't take action. No sabe, mucha persona aquí habla español. Es muy importante. Toda persona tiene un corazón y tú hablas para Dios. ¿Qué cambio? ¿Qué necesito cambio? Tú necesito cambio. No otra persona. You need to change. You need to say, what is my responsibility to this? I keep blaming on the interpreter. I need a better interpreter. No, I needed to be proactive about where I wanted to stand, about what I wanted to get done, and what can I control, Andre? So I can control. I found out not that long ago, I can't control my son. He's grown. He's 15 and he's grown. 1, 2, 3, 4, I thought I was controlling him. 10, 11, 12, he told me, nah, I just kind of listen to your dad. You know what I'm saying? I'll take your guidance, but I'm my own person. We collectively on this call and around the world have to say, what can I do, whether it's look around the room, whether it's learning Spanish, being proactive about leading conversations, like Sister said, and saying, what can I do? Don't put it on a third party, because you can't control what their outcomes are. You can control your outcomes. They're measurable. And lastly, the mass incarceration. Black people make up 12% of the country. 6%, 50% will be men. That's 6% of the country. Would it say 2% are either under 14 or over 60? So you're talking about 4% of the country are Black men between 18 and 40. 4% of the country makes up 40% of the prison system. That math does not work for me. That math does not work for me. That 4% of this country makes up 40% of the prison system. You can't, I mean, in any other business scenario, that would not work. No place would that make sense to anybody in any mathematical equation. I don't care if you went to the worst public school. That math doesn't work unless there's an active campaign, or just to say, okay, we're going to incarcerate these folks. And like Sister Susan said, it started with slavery. When slavery ended, it's like, what are we going to do with these people? What are we going to do? How are we going to put them back to work? And incarceration became a way of putting people back to work. Then as we went forward, it just stayed that. It stayed that. Then in the 80s, when money changed, it's like, okay, we don't want to have to deal with this population. So how do we control? Black people have been in control as far as being controlled since we got off the boat. The thing is, when we got off the boat, how do we control Black people? First, it was with whips and chains. You know what I'm saying? Then it was with Jim Crow's intimidation. You know what I'm saying? Then it was with just disenfranchisement. Now it's with incarceration. How do we control a mass of people? We put them in a place where we can control their day-to-day movement. And if they're there, they're not other places being universities. They're not other places competing for jobs against my kid. They're not other. Don't let LeBron James make you feel as though the world is great. I love LeBron. He is not the world. He's one man. And when Morgan Freeman says he doesn't experience racism, I love Morgan Freeman. That's his life. I experience racism. I'm not arguing with him. I don't expect him to argue with me. People have their own lives. So we have to say 4% makes up 40%. That math does not work. If your family or your race was on the back end of that math, you would not be accepting of it. But it's acceptable when it's Black folks. There's no place in America where 735 white people have been shot in one city. It's acceptable in Chicago. There's no place in America where people live in below poverty lines. It's acceptable in Detroit. Why is it acceptable? Because it's an old saying, when good people say and do nothing, bad things happen. So
let me break into this, because I know at least a couple of our panel members have a hard stop, and I'm pressed against the clock. I wish we had a couple of hours here. So let me just give Najoh and Susan just 30 seconds each, no pressure. If there's a thought you want to share, closing thought, because then I need to make some announcements as well. So Najoh, any parting thoughts?
I would say anti-racism, of course, is real, but I think we have a global community here. And so I'd look to also take action on anyone who has prejudice against them. Colorism is also real. So whether you're in Brazil or you're in Asia or you're in India or other places, don't think just because you might not be sitting in the United States or because you may not have a large African-American population that there's not some activity you can do today. These things are universal and they exist in the US and everywhere. So I would just say, not just for my own people, but for all people, at that minimum, take action on that. I could, go to every ism, but while we're on race, I would just look at colorism as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Najoh. Susan, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, let's not be lulled to sleep. Andre already mentioned how, Rodney King, there was a big Martin Luther King. I just don't want this to be another. It feels different, but I wasn't there for some of those other ones. Like, let's just not let this be a moment. And people are like, oh, 2020, that was really great. Like, we all thought racism was over when we had our first, the nation's first Black president here in the United States. And a few years later, it's proven that racism is still very much alive and well. And so I think just don't lose the endurance. Like, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We're constantly learning. We're constantly having to address our own prejudices. We're constantly being put in situations where we're going to have to choose the side of justice. and just keep fighting, keep persevering, and it's going to be exhausting. Rest, that it's this work that we're talking about is for those of us who are Black or people of color. We don't have the option to not work on it because it's our lived experience. But it's easy to get tired. And so just my encouragement to everybody is just to not let this be a moment, not let this be a really great summer that we had and now it's over, but to continue fighting in whatever way we can.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to have to leave it there, and I've got like 1 minute for 5 minutes of announcements I need to make. I could have talked to you guys for a couple more hours. I really want to thank you for being with us, and I would encourage everybody to look these folks up. I know that they're all doing some really great work, and thank you again for your participation on the panel, the panelists, and everybody else who is here. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn off our webcams, and again, thank you so much for participating. I do have a couple of reflection questions that I'd like you to think about. How are you feeling at this moment? What did you learn about yourself? What will I do? Ask yourself these questions. What unanswered questions do I still have? And will I ask them? And who will I ask? Just a couple of things. One thing that I wanted to just really be clear about this, one of our other sponsors of this session is the P&G Alumni Network Foundation. We are very fortunate to have worked for a company that's got this sort of alumni foundation, and they do some really great work. And with the systemic racism issues that we've experienced, the foundation is continuing to proactively address economic inequities as well. And so these are some ways that you can get involved and reach out to the foundation, and please consider P&G Alumni Foundation in your philanthropic work at the end of this year, and we thank you for considering that. There's going to be a recording of this webinar, this panel on our YouTube channel, as well as pgalums.com, or you could drop a line as well if you want to get some information at hello@pgalums.com. Next month, we have a treat in that we are going to have Damon Jones, Chief Communications Officer of Procter & Gamble, with us as our guest speaker on January 12th, and we hope that you can join us. Thank you again for participating and sending questions. I apologize we weren't able to address all of the questions, but this is a broad topic. I do want to thank our panelists once again for the perspective that you've shared here and the work you're doing in the world. So thank you again, and we are going to go ahead and conclude the webinar now.